The morning of Sophia's engagement felt like sunlight and nerves. Margaret stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the simple pearl earrings she'd worn on her own wedding day. They weren't flashy, but they were hers, a small token of love and memory. She smoothed down her lavender dress, one she had saved for months to buy. It wasn't designer, but it made her feel graceful. Today, she thought, was supposed to be a celebration, a moment of pride. Her daughter, Sophia, was getting engaged to Ethan Cole, the son of a wealthy real estate developer. The Coles were everything Margaret wasn't: polished, upper class, and precise. Their world ran on money, not effort. Still, she reminded herself that love didn't have to care about class. Sophia had always been ambitious. And Margaret had always admired that. When Margaret arrived at the engagement venue, a chandelier-lit ballroom filled with laughter and the scent of roses, she felt both proud and out of place. Waiters in tuxedos glided between guests holding champagne flutes. People in designer suits mingled easily, exchanging air kisses and business cards. She recognized none of them. Sophia was radiant in an ivory gown, her hair in soft curls that looked like something out of a bridal magazine. But when her eyes met her mother's, the warmth wasn't there. She smiled, briefly, but it was the kind of smile you give to a stranger you're obliged to greet. Margaret brushed it off. Big events made people nervous, she told herself. She found her seat quietly, admiring the elaborate decorations, towering floral arrangements, a champagne fountain, crystal centerpieces that caught the light like stars. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. "Mrs. Cole, this is my mother, Margaret," Sophia said later, bringing her over to meet Ethan's family. The older woman, poised, manicured, and coldly elegant, looked Margaret up and down. "Oh," she said with polite surprise, "you're Sophia's mother." "A nurse, wasn't it?" "Yes," Margaret said softly. 30 years now. How adorable." Mrs. Cole smiled, the kind of smile that says more with its edges than its meaning. "It takes a certain kind of endurance to live that kind of life, doesn't it?" Margaret simply nodded, pretending not to hear the condescension wrapped in silk throughout the evening. She tried to blend in, clapping when others clapped, smiling through the ache of being invisible in her daughter's world. She thought back to the nights she'd stayed awake helping Sophia finish school projects, the meals skipped to afford tuition, the endless encouragement she'd given her to chase dreams bigger than their small apartment. All those years had led to this, and yet, somehow, she felt more distant from her daughter than ever. As speeches began, laughter filled the air. Ethan's father toasted to the union of two families with shared values and ambitions. When it was Margaret's turn, her hands trembled slightly as she stood. "I just want to say," she began, voice gentle but proud, "that watching Sophia grow into the woman she is today has been my greatest joy. I may not have had much to give her in wealth, but I hope I gave her enough in love." "Mom," Sophia interrupted sharply, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Let's not make this about the past, okay?" The silence that followed was heavy. Margaret froze, her smile faltering. Sophia forced a laugh, turning to the guests. "She just gets emotional sometimes. You know how moms are." A few people chuckled politely, but Margaret's heart dropped. The warmth drained from her body. She sat down quietly, her toast unfinished. Her pride shattered somewhere between the laughter and the lights. As music swelled again, she clapped weakly, eyes stinging. What was supposed to be the happiest day of her daughter's life had already begun to taste like heartbreak. And deep inside, Margaret felt something she'd never felt before toward her only child. Not anger, but the quiet birth of distance. The engagement party, meant to sparkle with joy, had begun to feel like a theater where Margaret was cast as an extra. She tried to gather herself after Sophia's interruption during the toast, taking slow sips of champagne as the music swirled around her. The room was bright crystal chandeliers refracting light across polished marble floors, but the warmth she had imagined for the day seemed to have evaporated. Sophia, dressed in her pristine ivory gown, glided through the crowd with effortless grace, laughing with her fiancé's parents as if Margaret didn't exist. Margaret watched quietly, forcing herself to smile as others complimented her daughter. She noticed the subtle glances, the whispers exchanged, all the judgments of someone who had spent her life in modest means. Now, standing outside this gilded circle, then came the first speech from Ethan's mother. Margaret had expected some polite words, maybe a touch of formality. Instead, Mrs. Cole leaned into the microphone with an air of calculated elegance. "We are thrilled to welcome Sophia into our family," she began, voice smooth as silk, eyes scanning the room like a hawk. "Of course, it is always inspiring to see the fruit of dedication and ambition, though sometimes one must remember that certain standards are expected when joining a family like ours." The words were subtle, but the sting was immediate. Margaret's hands tightened around her glass. She knew the implication. Her life, her sacrifices, her hard work as a single mother, all were invisible. She was judged, dismissed, as if her worth had only been a stepping stone for Sophia to climb higher. Margaret looked to Sophia for support, but her daughter's expression was unreadable. A faint smirk curved her lips as if this was all some performance in which she alone was the star. Margaret felt a hot flush of humiliation, yet she kept her composure. Later, when it was Margaret's turn to offer a personal toast, she hesitated. She had wanted to speak from the heart, to honor the journey she and Sophia had shared, the countless nights spent studying together, the small victories, the sacrifices that had quietly shaped Sophia into the woman she was. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret began, voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest, "I want to say that being Sophia's mother has been the greatest privilege of my life. Watching her grow, learning from her laughter, and seeing her achieve her dreams has been—" "Mom!" Sophia's voice sliced through the room, sharper than any blade. Conversations froze mid-word. Eyes turned toward the source of the disruption. Sophia's hands were on her hips, her eyes blazing with irritation. "Can we not make this about you right now?" The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. She opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. The careful composure she had cultivated for years shattered in an instant. Sophia turned to the gathered guests. Forcing a laugh that Margaret recognized too well, the laughter of someone performing for approval, masking shame with charm. "You know how moms are," she said lightly, as though dismissing her mother was amusing. Margaret's heart sank. This wasn't the playful teasing of childhood or the occasional adolescent rebellion. This was a public severing of the bond she had nurtured every day for 18 years. She lowered herself back into her chair, silent. The taste of betrayal bitter on her tongue, around her. The party continued, laughter, clinking glasses, and polite conversations, but Margaret felt entirely alone. The room seemed to shrink, closing in around her humiliation. She forced herself to smile again for appearances, but inside, a storm was forming. Something within her shifted that night. Not anger, not revenge yet, but a sharp, clear realization. The past she had built with Sophia could no longer shield her from this new reality. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Champagne flowed, conversations danced around her, and Sophia shone in the spotlight. But Margaret's world had changed. She returned home that night not with the elation of a proud mother, but with the quiet, gnawing ache of betrayal. And somewhere deep in her heart she began to consider that perhaps love alone would no longer be enough. The days after Sophia's engagement were heavy with silence. Margaret woke each morning expecting a phone call, a message, even a text to say, "I'm sorry, Mom," but there was nothing. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter, blinking occasionally with spam notifications, yet never with her daughter's name. The quiet was deafening, filled with the echo of those 3 words Sophia had uttered at the engagement party, "I disown you." Margaret tried to resume her normal routine, but even the familiar rhythms of her life seemed out of reach. She went to the grocery store, walked past neighbors, and waved politely, yet felt invisible. At work, colleagues noticed her quiet demeanor. One asked, "Everything okay at home?" Margaret forced a smile and nodded, unwilling to reveal the storm that churned beneath her calm exterior. Friends called to check in, offering comforting words and gentle advice. She didn't mean it, they said. Teens sometimes speak without thinking. Margaret listened politely, but she knew better. Sophia wasn't 16 anymore. She was 26, a woman poised to step into a life of wealth and privilege. Those words weren't a momentary lapse, they were a declaration. She remembered the sharp look in Sophia's eyes, the smirk as she dismissed her mother's heartfelt toast. There had been no hesitation, no fleeting regret, just a cold, deliberate attempt to sever ties. Margaret's chest tightened at the memory. How had she failed to notice this growing pride, this resentment festering quietly beneath her daughter's smiles over the years? Margaret spent hours replaying the engagement night in her mind. She remembered the quiet judgments of the Coles, the way Sophia had aligned herself with them, the dismissive laughter at her mother's words. Every detail was a needle in her heart. She walked through her home, looking at photographs of Sophia as a child, her tiny hand clasped in Margaret's, her first steps captured in golden frames. Memories that had once brought joy now cut with sharp precision, highlighting the vast distance between mother and daughter, yet amid the pain, a strange clarity emerged. Margaret realized she had spent her life giving everything, her time, her energy, her very being, for someone who could erase her with a single phrase. Love alone had not been enough to preserve respect. And if respect could be so easily discarded, perhaps it was time to consider protecting herself in a way she had never imagined. She began researching quietly. Late at night, poring over legal documents, wills and trusts. What options did she have to safeguard her assets from a daughter who seemed intent on rejecting her entirely? She felt no malice yet, only a deep need for justice, a recognition that the sacrifices she had made should not be used against her, or handed to someone who openly disowned her. Her friends noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor. The woman who had once been gentle, forgiving, almost self-effacing now exuded a quiet strength, a determination that was palpable. When they asked what was different, Margaret only smiled faintly and said, "Sometimes you learn that love doesn't mean giving everything away to someone who won't honor it." Margaret's evenings became a mix of reflection and planning. She drafted letters she never sent, imagined conversations with Sophia that would never happen, and slowly began to chart a new course for her life, one that did not depend on her daughter's approval or affection. Each day, the ache in her heart mingled with the faint stirrings of resolve. The betrayal had been sharp, public and humiliating, yet it had awakened in Margaret something she had not felt before, a quiet, unyielding determination to reclaim agency over her life, her legacy, and her dignity. Sophia may have disowned her, but Margaret realized that she, too, could make a choice about what love, family, and loyalty truly meant. By the end of the week, Margaret had made her decision. She would not wait for reconciliation that might never come. She would take action legally to ensure that her daughter could no longer wield her sacrifices as entitlement. It was not vengeance, she told herself, but clarity, and for the first time in months, she felt a measure of peace amidst the storm. 2 weeks after the engagement, Margaret found herself standing outside the polished glass doors of a law office in downtown. The city hummed around her, a blur of taxis and pedestrians, but inside, the air smelled faintly of leather-bound books and faint coffee, a place of order and decisions. Margaret clutched her purse a little tighter, the small pearl earrings from the engagement party glinting in the morning light. She had spent nights wrestling with her emotions, and finally, she had come to one conclusion. Sophia's words were not just hurtful. They demanded action. She was greeted by her family lawyer, Mr. Daniels, a composed man in his 60s with a calm demeanor and keen eyes. He ushered her into a private office, the walls lined with degrees and plaques, the shelves heavy with files that smelled faintly of history and authority. "Margaret," he said warmly, "it's been a while. How are you holding up?" Margaret forced a smile, letting a sliver of vulnerability show. "I'm managing," she replied, her voice steady. "But I need to talk about something important." "About Sophia?" Mr. Daniels gestured for her to sit, his pen poised. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Margaret took a deep breath. She disowned me at her engagement. And I think it's time to take it seriously. Legally, I want to ensure she cannot inherit anything from me." Mr. Daniels raised an eyebrow, but it wasn't surprise. He had seen countless family disputes. "Are you certain?" he asked gently. "This is a serious step. Once the documents are changed, it's irrevocable unless you choose to reverse them. Are you prepared for the consequences?" Margaret nodded firmly, the memory of the engagement night fresh and sharp in her mind. "Yes, I've tried patience, forgiveness, everything. But respect isn't something you can force. She made her choice. I'm simply making mine." The lawyer leaned back, tapping his pen thoughtfully. "We can draft a new will, reassigning your assets elsewhere. You can also establish trusts for charitable causes or others who would honor your legacy. Do you have someone in mind?" Margaret paused, considering. Her mind wandered to the women she had once counseled through the local foster program, the single mothers who reminded her of her younger self, resilient, struggling, and deserving. A small smile lifted her lips. "Yes," she said finally. "I want the majority to go to a foundation that supports single mothers, those who need a chance, the way I once needed one." Mr. Daniels nodded approvingly. "That's a thoughtful choice. We'll make the necessary legal adjustments. Sophia's inheritance will be legally redirected, and you will remain in full control of the process. It will take some paperwork, notarization, and updates to your estate plan, but it's entirely feasible." Margaret felt a wave of relief, mixed with a strange tinge of power. Not revenge in the traditional sense. This wasn't about hurting Sophia, but about reclaiming control, about aligning her assets with her values rather than someone who had publicly rejected her. As she signed forms and discussed details, Margaret felt a clarity she hadn't felt in months. The humiliation of the engagement, the sting of betrayal, all of it began to crystallize into a firm resolve. She realized that love alone could not secure respect, and that self-preservation was not selfish. It was necessary. Before leaving, she paused and looked out the office window at the city beyond. The streets were busy, the world moving forward. For the first time since Sophia's words, Margaret felt as if she were moving forward too. The path ahead wasn't easy, and the emotional distance between her and her daughter was a wound that might never heal. But Margaret also understood something profound. She no longer needed Sophia's approval to feel whole or valued. As she stepped out into the sunlight, the breeze carrying a faint scent of autumn leaves, Margaret felt a small smile form, not one of triumph, but of quiet certainty. She had made her choice, and for the first time she felt entirely at peace with it. Sophia's world, which had seemed perfect in the weeks following her engagement, began to show cracks in ways she hadn't anticipated. The sparkling photos she posted on social media, designer gowns, champagne toasts, and luxury trips projected an image of seamless happiness. Friends and colleagues complimented her elegance and poise, while her fiancé Ethan seemed endlessly proud. But behind the glossy surface, reality was far more fragile. At first, the subtle signs were almost imperceptible. Ethan began managing her finances more closely, offering advice on budgeting that felt less like guidance and more like control. "It's unwise for a future Mrs. Cole to have financial independence," he said casually one evening, rearranging statements and bills on the kitchen counter. Sophia had laughed nervously at first, thinking it was a joke. But as the days passed, the restrictions tightened. Her credit card limits were scrutinized, her investments questioned, and every decision she tried to make met with condescension. Then there were the Coles themselves. Ethan's parents, whose judgment had been sharp at the engagement, began to distance themselves. Any mention of Margaret was met with a cool, dismissive look, or worse, an outright suggestion that Sophia forget her past. Invitations she had once expected, brunches, social gatherings, weekend trips, were quietly rescinded. She realized she was slowly being cut out of the very family she had strived to impress. One evening, alone in their lavish apartment, Sophia flipped through her phone, scrolling past photographs of her childhood, a time of warmth, security, and unconditional love. Her eyes landed on one image in particular, Margaret holding her tiny hand on a rainy day, smiling despite the mud on their shoes. Sophia's chest tightened as guilt crept in, unwelcome and uncomfortable. She wanted to call her mother, to bridge the growing chasm, but she hesitated. Pride, vanity, and fear of exposure held her back. When Sophia finally reached out, a tentative text asking if she could talk, the response she received was polite but firm, no direct answer. Only acknowledgement that her mother was busy. Weeks passed, and every attempt she made to reconnect was met with the same distance. Margaret's legal move to redirect her inheritance had been completed quietly, without fanfare. Sophia would never receive a dime from her mother's estate. The realization hit her like a cold wave. Her mother had followed through. She had been disowned, legally and emotionally. The lavish lifestyle that had once seemed a protective bubble now felt like a gilded cage. Ethan's controlling tendencies, the Coles' disapproval, and the absence of her mother's guidance left Sophia vulnerable and increasingly anxious. She began to see the truth behind Margaret's sacrifices, the years of love and dedication that had built her foundation. And for the first time she understood the depth of what she had rejected. Sophia's friends noticed the change too. She was no longer carefree and radiant. She was anxious, uncertain, and increasingly dependent on Ethan's approval. Even the smallest disagreements would escalate into arguments, leaving her feeling powerless in a world she had once thought she had mastered. One quiet night, staring at the ceiling of her opulent bedroom, Sophia finally admitted to herself what she had been avoiding. She had underestimated the value of her mother's love. She had chased status, wealth, and appearances, only to find that they were hollow without respect, guidance, and care. Margaret's absence was not just emotional, it was a reminder of the consequences of pride, entitlement, and disconnection. For the first time, Sophia feared that her life, as she had carefully curated it, was unraveling. And she began to understand a bitter truth: some opportunities, once lost, cannot be regained. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when Sophia finally picked up the phone and dialed her mother's number. The sky had darkened early, clouds heavy and gray, and the sound of rain tapping against the apartment windows mirrored the tension coiling in her chest. Her hands shook slightly as she pressed the keys, her finger hovering over the call button for a moment too long. She had rehearsed what she would say 100 times, apologies, explanations, excuses, but none of it felt adequate. "Please pick up," she whispered under her breath. As if the universe itself could hear her plea, the phone rang. And rang. No answer. Sophia's chest tightened. Panic bubbled up. She left a message. "Mom, it's me. I need to see you. I was wrong. Please call me back. I miss you." Hours passed with no reply. The anxiety gnawed at her, sharp and relentless. She tried again the next day, then the next, each message more desperate than the last. She even called her friends, trying to coax them into finding her mother's whereabouts. But Margaret's life had always been quiet and private. Nobody seemed to know where she was staying. Finally, after a week of frantic searching, Sophia discovered through a neighbor that Margaret had moved, sold her house quietly, no announcement, no fanfare. She had relocated to a small coastal town several hours away, a place that was quiet, peaceful, and far removed from the opulence Sophia had grown accustomed to. Sophia rented a car that Saturday morning, the engine roaring beneath her as she drove along the highway, the rain still falling in relentless sheets. Her mind raced, filled with guilt, fear, and an unfamiliar vulnerability. She imagined her mother's face, calm, dignified, possibly even resentful. Would Margaret even see her? Would she answer the door if Sophia knocked? The coastal town arrived as a quiet, almost sleepy place. Narrow streets, painted cottages, and the faint scent of salt in the air. Sophia found Margaret's house, modest but warm, with a small garden in the front. Her hands trembled as she rang the doorbell. And when the door opened, Margaret stood there, calm and composed, as if she had been expecting Sophia all along. "Mom," Sophia began, her voice catching, tears brimming. I made a mistake. I didn't mean what I said. I was foolish and proud and stupid. Please, can we talk?" Margaret's expression was unreadable. She stepped aside to let Sophia in but said nothing. The silence between them was thick, the kind that speaks louder than words. Sophia's heart pounded as she tried again. I was wrong to disown you. I just wanted, I don't know. I wanted a new life, a better life, and I didn't see what I was throwing away. I need you. Margaret finally spoke, her voice calm, measured. You said you disowned me. I simply respected your choice. Sophia blinked, confusion and fear mixing in her chest. What do you mean? Margaret gestured toward a small stack of papers on the kitchen table. I had the lawyer finalize the changes. Your inheritance is no longer yours. I've redirected it to causes I care about, causes that honor what I value. The weight of her mother's words hit Sophia like a physical blow. Her stomach turned, her hands shook, and for the first time in years, she felt the depth of her own recklessness. Margaret's decision was final, deliberate, and unyielding. Sophia sank into a chair, tears slipping freely. Mom, I didn't know. I didn't mean. Margaret shook her head gently. Intentions don't undo actions. Love alone doesn't demand respect. You disowned me. I simply followed through in a way that aligns with my values. For the first time, Sophia realized she had lost more than wealth or convenience. She had lost the person who had built her world from scratch, the one who had sacrificed everything for her. And now there was no undoing it. Sophia sat on the edge of Margaret's modest sofa, trembling, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. The rain outside tapped softly against the windows, a steady rhythm that mirrored the pounding in her chest. For years, she had imagined this reunion differently, apologies, forgiveness, perhaps even tears of relief and reconciliation. But the reality was far harsher, far quieter. Margaret stood across from her. Calm and composed, her hands folded neatly in front of her. There was no anger in her eyes, no scolding. Just the quiet certainty of someone who had made a choice and had no reason to waver. Mom, Sophia began, voice cracking. I know I hurt you. I was wrong. I didn't mean what I said. I was proud, selfish. Margaret raised a hand gently, stopping her. You said you disowned me, Sophia. I didn't have to respond, but I did. I respected your words, and I acted accordingly. Sophia's eyes widened. Acted accordingly? What? What do you mean? Margaret motioned to a neatly stacked pile of documents on the coffee table. The lawyer has finalized the updates to my estate. Your inheritance is no longer yours. It has been redirected to causes I care about, to people who will honor what I value, much like I honored you with my love all these years. The words hit Sophia like a physical force. She sank further into the sofa, her mind spinning. You did this? Without even telling me? How could you? Margaret's tone was steady, unshakable. I gave you everything I could. My time, my sacrifices, my life. Respect, care, and love were always offered freely. But respect cannot be demanded, Sophia. You chose to reject it publicly and deliberately. I merely acted to protect myself and my legacy. Tears ran down Sophia's cheeks as she tried to form words, but the guilt and panic choked her voice. Mom, please. I'm sorry. I'll do anything. I just want a second chance. I don't want to lose you. Please. Margaret took a deep breath and sat down across from her daughter, maintaining her calm composure. This isn't about punishment, Sophia. I am not cruel. I am clear. Actions have consequences. You have made choices, and now you must live with them. But I love you. Sophia blurted, her desperation spilling out. I always loved you. I didn't know how to show it, and Margaret's expression softened slightly, though the resolve in her eyes did not waver. Love without respect is hollow. I will always carry love for you in my heart, but it cannot override the reality of your choices. You wanted a life separate from me. I am simply honoring your decision. The room fell silent except for the soft patter of rain. Sophia realized in a crushing moment of clarity that her mother's decision was final. The inheritance she had counted on, the sense of security she had taken for granted, had been removed. More than that, Margaret had taken control of her own life. A life that Sophia had once assumed she could shape or claim. Sophia buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. I didn't know. I never realized what I was throwing away. Margaret reached out, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. And now you know. The lesson is harsh but necessary. You cannot undo what was said, only learn from it. One day I hope you will understand. Sophia lifted her tear-streaked face to meet her mother's eyes. There was no forgiveness yet. Only the weight of truth, the realization that love alone, however profound, cannot substitute for respect, gratitude, or responsibility. Margaret stood, gathering the papers she had laid out. I will always hope for your growth, Sophia. But growth cannot be rushed, forced, or dictated. It must come from within. That is your path to redemption, if you choose it. And with that, Margaret moved toward the kitchen, leaving Sophia to sit in stunned silence. The enormity of her loss and the clarity of her mother's wisdom settling like stones in her chest. In the weeks following the confrontation, Sophia's carefully curated life began to unravel. The luxurious world she had once flaunted on social media now felt fragile and unsustainable, a glittering facade that could not withstand the truth she had ignored for so long. Ethan, her fiancé, grew increasingly controlling. He scrutinized every expense, questioned every decision, and made it clear that her opinions were secondary to his. The power dynamic Sophia had once welcomed now felt suffocating. Even the Coles, whose approval she had chased relentlessly, started to distance themselves. Invitations to social events dwindled, and once warm smiles became polite, measured nods. Their message was unmistakable. Without Margaret's wealth as a safety net, Sophia had less value in their world. The social status she had believed she was securing had been conditional all along, and that condition was now void. Sophia's friends noticed the change too. The girl who had once been carefree, elegant, and ambitious was now anxious, withdrawn, and dependent on the approval of others. Her laughter, once effortless, now carried a tremor, as if every word were calculated to avoid judgment. Late at night, when she was alone in the penthouse apartment that had once felt like a palace, she would stare at the ceiling and replay her mother's calm, unyielding words. Actions have consequences. You wanted a life separate from me. I am simply honoring your decision. Sophia began to grasp the magnitude of what she had lost. Her mother's love, the quiet sacrifices, the long nights, the emotional scaffolding that had supported her through childhood, was irreplaceable. Wealth, status, and appearances could not fill the void left by decades of guidance and care. She had severed the most essential connection of her life, and there was no immediate way to mend it. One evening, after a particularly tense argument with Ethan about finances, Sophia found herself sitting in the empty dining room, trembling and exhausted. The grandeur of the apartment suddenly seemed meaningless. The designer furniture, the polished floors, and the expensive artwork were nothing but a reminder of the hollow life she had pursued. In that quiet, she realized that Margaret's decision to redirect the inheritance was not merely about money, it was a reflection of values. Respect and dignity. Sophia tried to call Margaret again, but each attempt ended in frustration. Her mother had built walls that were firm yet fair, boundaries that demanded acknowledgement of wrongdoing and genuine growth before any reconciliation could occur. The law had formalized what words had already symbolized. Sophia's choices had consequences, and love alone could not erase them. Panic and regret set in. She began to see herself clearly, not as the sophisticated, enviable woman she had projected to the world, but as a child who had rejected the one person who had given everything to shape her. Pride and vanity had led her astray, and now she was facing a life stripped of certainty. Comfort and unconditional support, work, once a minor component of her life, became a source of anxiety. She realized that she had relied on Margaret's legacy not only emotionally but practically. Without the inheritance, she was forced to confront her own limitations, her lack of preparedness for independence, and the consequences of her hasty, prideful decisions. The crushing truth settled over her. Privilege and appearances could not protect her from the reality of her choices. She had disowned the one person who had truly loved her unconditionally, and that loss reverberated through every aspect of her life. For the first time, Sophia understood the meaning of responsibility, humility, and true value. The world she had built on surface-level success was crumbling, and she had no one to blame but herself. Margaret's quiet resolve had reshaped her reality, leaving Sophia to confront the consequences of pride, greed, and disrespect. It was a harsh, painful lesson, but one Sophia would never forget. The life she had imagined was gone, and she was left to navigate a path she had once thought she controlled, now marked by accountability, regret, and the distant hope of redemption. A year had passed since Sophia's engagement and the confrontation with her mother, and the world she had once envisioned was nearly unrecognizable. The life of ease and glamour had slipped through her fingers, leaving behind a harsh reality she could no longer ignore. Ethan, her fiancé, had grown impatient with her inability to maintain the perfect facade. Arguments over money, lifestyle, and decisions escalated until, finally, he walked away, leaving Sophia alone in the vast apartment that now felt more like a cage than a home. The Coles, too, had moved on. Their once warm attention had vanished, replaced by cold indifference. Invitations ceased entirely. In a world where status had dictated relationships, Sophia realized too late that her worth had never been intrinsic. It had been conditional, dependent on wealth, appearance, and proximity to privilege. Margaret's legal decisions had permanently shifted the balance, leaving Sophia exposed to a life she had never truly prepared for. Sophia's friends noticed the change immediately. The confident, radiant woman they had known was replaced by someone cautious, anxious, and unsure. She spent hours staring at her phone, drafting and deleting messages to her mother, each attempt a mixture of hope, guilt, and desperation. But Margaret remained distant, not out of cruelty, but from principle. Sophia had disowned her, and Margaret had respected that choice, and now the consequences were irreversible. For the first time, Sophia confronted the reality of her actions. The moments of selfish pride, the desire to impress others at the expense of her mother, the public declaration of disownment, all had led to this unyielding truth. Her mother's love, which had once been a steady foundation, was no longer hers to claim. Wealth and status could not replace years of guidance, sacrifice, and unconditional care. Sophia found herself back in the neighborhoods of her childhood, walking past the schools she had attended, the parks where she had played, the small streets she had once explored with her mother. She had thought she was escaping the modesty of her upbringing, but now she realized it had been the very foundation of her strength. Margaret's quiet sacrifices had prepared her for life, but Sophia had rejected them in favor of superficial ambition. One evening, Sophia received a letter, not a scolding, not a confrontation, but a formal notice from the lawyer confirming the redirection of her mother's assets. The words were simple, precise, and final. Margaret had donated the inheritance to causes that mattered to her, foundations supporting single mothers, educational programs, and community development. There was no room for negotiation, no loophole to exploit, only the stark reality of her mother's deliberate choices. Sophia sat quietly, absorbing the consequences. For the first time, she felt the weight of true accountability. Her life, stripped of illusions and privilege, demanded reflection, humility, and growth. She began to understand that her mother's actions were not about vengeance but about integrity, values, and teaching a lesson she had ignored in her youth. Respect must be earned, not assumed. Slowly, Sophia began to rebuild her life from scratch. She found work in a small firm, modest but honest. She lived simply, thought deeply, and reflected on her mistakes. Each day she carried the lessons of pride, entitlement, and the irrevocable nature of choices. And though the path was difficult, it was real, grounded, and full of potential for genuine growth. Margaret's influence, though absent in presence, had left an indelible mark. The woman who had once disowned her daughter had, in a sense, guided her even now, through boundaries, through accountability, and through the irrevocable consequences of actions. Sophia's regrets were profound, but so too was the opportunity to learn, to grow, and perhaps one day to reconcile in spirit if not in circumstance. In the quiet moments of reflection, Sophia understood the truth that had eluded her for so long. Love is not enough without respect. Care is meaningless without acknowledgement. And choices, once made, shape the course of a life far more than privilege ever could. Months later, Margaret sat at her small desk in the coastal cottage she had moved into after selling her city home. The room was simple, a single lamp casting a warm glow, stacks of books on one side, and a journal open before her. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly, waves rolling in rhythmically, a soothing counterpoint to the turbulence of the past year. She had come to cherish this quiet life, away from judgment, pretension, and the pain that had once defined her connection with her daughter. Margaret picked up her pen and began to write. The words flowed slowly, carefully chosen, not out of anger or resentment, but from a place of clarity and acceptance. Dear Sophia, she began, I have thought about you every day. I have replayed every memory, every sacrifice, every moment of love I have given you. I have also reflected on the choices you made, choices that hurt me deeply. You disowned me in a moment that could not be undone, and I respected your words. I acted not in anger, but in alignment with my values. Her hand paused over the page. The truth of her own emotions pressed in. Love had not disappeared. It could not, despite the pain. But she had learned the hard way that love without respect could be hollow, and care without acknowledgement could be taken for granted. Margaret's gaze drifted to the ocean outside, its endless expanse a reminder of life's vast possibilities. Of resilience and of quiet endurance, I want you to know. She continued, that I do not hold vengeance in my heart. The inheritance you once expected has been given to causes that honor what I value: women, children, and families who need a chance to build a better life. In doing this, I have found peace, and I hope in time you will understand. Life is full of lessons, some harsh, some gentle, and this is one you must learn on your own. She dipped the pen again and wrote more, her thoughts softening with reflection. I have loved you beyond measure. I always will. But love does not mean giving everything at the expense of your own dignity and values. I am still proud of you, not for what you have or will have, but for the person I hope you will become, someone who learns humility, gratitude, and integrity. My hope is that one day you will see the value of the life I built for you, the sacrifices I made, and the love that never wavered. Margaret set the pen down and read the letter through. It was final yet gentle, firm yet compassionate. She did not expect a reply. The letter was not a plea for forgiveness, nor an invitation to immediate reconciliation. It was a closing of one chapter, a guidepost for the next, a way for Sophia to see, perhaps much later, that the path to understanding and growth was open. Even if she had chosen the difficult road, carefully, Margaret folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. She didn't immediately send it. Instead, she left it on the desk, a quiet offering to fate and time. Some lessons needed to be experienced fully before words could be appreciated. Some bridges could not be crossed until the traveler was ready. Margaret looked out the window, the waves rolling in like a gentle, endless heartbeat. For the first time in months, she felt wholly at peace. She had acted with clarity, integrity, and courage. She had honored her life, her values, and the love she still held for her daughter. And in that, she realized the truth she had always known but had learned anew. Sometimes the hardest act of love is knowing when to let go. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the water. Margaret closed her journal, leaned back, and allowed herself a quiet smile. Life would continue, ever changing, ever challenging, but she was ready, whole, dignified, and free.